The first gunshot rang out just as Nora Lloyd stepped onto the auction block, her white wedding dress trailing in the dust behind her. She blinked back tears, squinting against the harsh Montana sun of 1876, as she faced the sea of unfamiliar faces that had gathered to bid on her, a mail-order bride whose intended husband had died 3 days before her arrival. $5. I start the bidding at $5 for this fine Eastern lady. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowded street of Silver Creek. Look at her, gents. Education enough to teach your young'uns and pretty enough to warm your cabin. Nora's cheeks burned with humiliation. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been a schoolteacher in Boston, desperate enough to answer an advertisement seeking a bride for a Montana rancher. The letters from Jonathan Blackwell had been kind, promising a good life if not a romantic one. But when her stagecoach arrived, she'd been greeted not by her intended husband but by news of his passing and worse, his outstanding debts. The woman's passage was paid for and debts must be settled, the auctioneer continued. Who'll give me $10? A few hands raised. Nora bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. The widow who had taken her in briefly had explained that Jonathan's creditors had legal claim to his property, which apparently included the bride he'd sent for. In the territories where law was fluid and women scarce, such auctions weren't unheard of, though rarely so public. $15, called a gray-haired man with a leering smile. $20, shouted another, his breath reeking of whiskey even from 10 feet away. Nora closed her eyes, her hands trembling as they clutched the small reticule containing her few remaining possessions, a handkerchief, $3, and a miniature portrait of her deceased parents. $25 to the gentleman in the back. The bids climbed slowly, painfully. $50. $65, each number a nail in the coffin of Nora's dreams. She had come west for a fresh start, for security if not love. Now she was being sold to the highest bidder like cattle. $75, called a portly man who owned the saloon. $100, came a quiet voice from the back of the crowd. The crowd parted slightly, murmurs rippling through the gathered men. Nora opened her eyes to see who had placed the substantial bid. A tall man stood with his hat pulled low, leaning against a hitching post. His face was partially obscured, but she could make out a strong jawline dusted with stubble. $100 from Mr. Colton Landry, the auctioneer announced with renewed enthusiasm. Do I hear 105? The saloon owner raised his hand reluctantly, then thought better of it. Everyone in Silver Creek knew Colton Landry, the quiet rancher whose spread north of town had doubled in size over the past 3 years. He rarely came to town except for supplies, and he never participated in social gatherings. Going once for $100, going twice. Nora held her breath, uncertain whether to hope for a higher bid or for the auction to end. Neither option promised freedom, sold, to Mr. Landry for $100. A tear slipped down Nora's cheek as the auctioneer gripped her elbow, leading her down the rickety steps toward her purchaser. Her legs nearly gave way beneath her, and she stumbled on the final step, expecting to fall face first into the dirt. Instead, strong hands caught her. Colton Landry had moved with surprising speed, reaching the bottom of the steps just as she faltered. Without a word, he lifted her down and set her gently on her feet, then released her immediately, as if the touch had burned him. I'll need that payment now, Mr. Landry, the auctioneer said, rubbing his hands together. Colton reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out the sum, every dollar to his name, though Nora couldn't know this, and handed it over without comment. She's all yours, the auctioneer said with a wink that made Nora's skin crawl. Pleasure doing business. The crowd began to disperse, some men casting disappointed glances their way, others simply moving on to the next entertainment. Nora stood frozen, waiting for her new owner to speak, to give orders to claim his purchase. Instead, Colton Landry tipped his hat back slightly, revealing deep blue eyes that assessed her with surprising gentleness. Miss Lloyd, he said, his voice low and even, I have a wagon just there. Would you care to sit while I finish my business in town? Nora blinked in surprise. You know my name. Jonathan wrote to me about you. We were acquaintances. He gestured toward a wagon laden with supplies. "Please rest if you wish, I won't be long." Nora hesitated, then nodded slightly and moved toward the wagon. She had little choice but to follow the instructions of the man who had purchased her, but his unexpected courtesy confused her. As she settled onto the wagon seat, she watched Colton stride toward the general store. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work, his shoulders broad beneath his worn denim jacket. Not once did he look back to ensure she remained where he had placed her. For a wild moment, Nora considered running. But where would she go? She had no money to speak of, no connections, and a woman alone in the territories faced dangers far worse than an auction block. At least this quiet rancher had shown a modicum of respect. 15 minutes later, Colton returned with a final parcel, which he added to the supplies in the wagon bed. Without a word, he climbed up beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them on the seat. "My ranch is about 2 hours' ride," he said, taking up the reins. "The road's rough in places." Nora squared her shoulders. "Mr. Landry, I should like to know your intentions." "You have purchased me, apparently, and I haven't purchased you, Miss Lloyd," he interrupted, his gaze fixed ahead as the horses began to move. "I paid a debt so those vultures couldn't harm you. You're not property and you owe me nothing." Nora stared at him, bewildered. "Then why, no decent man could watch what was happening and do nothing?" He glanced at her briefly, then away. "You have choices now. I can take you to my ranch where you can stay until you decide what you want to do. I have a small cabin separate from the main house where you'd have privacy. Or I can arrange passage back east if that's your preference." The wagon rumbled down the main street of Silver Creek, and Nora felt the stares of townspeople following them. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "I have no money to return east," she said finally. "I would provide it." "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Colton adjusted his hat, blocking the sun from his eyes. "As I said, Jonathan wrote about you. He was pleased with his choice of bride, said you were intelligent and resourceful, seemed to think you'd adapt well to life out here." A lump formed in Nora's throat. She had never met Jonathan Blackwell, had only his letters to form an impression of the man who was to be her husband. Now he was gone, and this stranger was offering her freedom when he could have demanded servitude. "I came west for a reason, Mr. Landry," she said after a long silence. "I have nothing to return to in Boston." He nodded once. "The offer remains open. For now, you're welcome at my ranch for as long as you need." They rode in silence as the town fell away behind them. The landscape opened up before them, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, the sky impossibly vast and blue above. Despite her circumstances, Nora felt something stir within her, a sense of possibility she hadn't expected to feel again after the humiliation of the auction block. "Thank you," she said quietly, not looking at him. Colton gave no indication he had heard, but his hands relaxed slightly on the reins. The road grew steadily rougher as they left the main trail, following a less traveled path that wound through stands of pine and across small streams. Nora gripped the seat as they bounced over ruts, trying to maintain her dignity despite the jostling. "Not much farther now," Colton said after they forded a shallow creek. "You'll see the house once we crest that rise." True to his word, as they reached the top of the hill, a homestead came into view in the valley below. It wasn't the crude cabin Nora had imagined, but a proper house, not large, but solidly built of logs with a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, along with several corrals containing horses. Beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and behind the house, a smaller cabin sat nestled against a stand of pines. "You have a beautiful place," Nora said, genuinely impressed. A hint of pride crossed Colton's face. "Built most of it myself. Started with 40 acres and a tent 5 years ago." "You've accomplished a great deal," he shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Hard work is all." As they approached the house, a dog came bounding out to meet them, a large, shaggy animal that barked enthusiastically. Behind him emerged an older man with a silver beard. "That's Hank," Colton explained. "He helps with the ranch, and the dog's Bear." Hank waved as they pulled up to the house. "Didn't expect you back so soon," he called, then paused when he noticed Nora. His eyebrows rose, but he quickly schooled his expression. "Miss Lloyd, this is Hank Miller," Colton said as he set the brake. "Hank, Miss Nora Lloyd. She'll be staying in the guest cabin for a time." To his credit, Hank didn't ask questions, he merely tipped his hat. "Madam." "Welcome to Landry Ranch." "Thank you," Nora said, summoning what dignity she could in her dusty wedding dress. She had worn it for her arrival, expecting to be married immediately upon reaching Silver Creek. Now it seemed a cruel joke. Colton jumped down from the wagon and, after a moment's hesitation, offered his hand to help Nora descend. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip steady as she stepped down. "Hank, would you mind unloading the supplies? I'll show Miss Lloyd to the cabin." "Course not." "Got some stew on for supper if you're both hungry." Colton nodded and gestured for Nora to follow him. The dog, Bear, trotted alongside them, occasionally looking up at Nora with curious eyes. "The cabin was meant for my parents," Colton explained as they walked the short distance to the smaller structure. "I built it hoping they'd join me from Tennessee, but my father passed before they could make the journey. My mother stayed with my sister back east." "I'm sorry about your father," Nora said. "It was 2 years ago now." He stopped at the cabin door and produced a key. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and weathertight." He pushed open the door to reveal a simple but comfortable space. A small sitting area with a stone fireplace occupied one side, a curtained-off sleeping area the other. A table with 2 chairs sat near a window that overlooked a small garden, currently dormant in the early spring. "There's a pump out back for water," Colton said, remaining in the doorway as Nora stepped inside. "Outhouse is behind the main house. You're welcome to take meals with Hank and me, or I can have food brought here if you prefer." Nora turned slowly, taking in the cabin. After the events of the day, the simple, clean space seemed like a palace. "This is very generous, Mr. Landry," he shrugged again, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his default response to gratitude. "I'll bring your belongings. I'm afraid I have very little," she admitted. "Most of my things were left with Mrs. Winters in town when the creditors came." Something like anger flashed across Colton's face. "I'll retrieve them tomorrow." Before she could protest, he was gone, boots crunching on the path outside. Nora sank onto a chair, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. Just yesterday, she had been preparing to meet her future husband. Now she was alone in a strange cabin, dependent on the kindness of a man she didn't know. The absurdity of it struck her suddenly, and a laugh escaped her lips, a sound tinged with hysteria that quickly transformed into a sob. She pressed her hands to her mouth, determined not to give in to tears. She had cried enough on that auction block. Now she needed to think clearly about her future. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Composing herself, she rose to find Colton standing there with her small carpet bag, the only possession she'd managed to keep, and a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Your bag," he said, handing it to her. "And some things you might need, soap, towels, a spare blanket. There's a dress in there too, might not fit perfectly, but it's clean." A dress? Nora was puzzled. A hint of color touched Colton's cheekbones. "Bought it off Mrs. Turner at the general store, figured you might want something besides." He gestured vaguely at her wedding dress. The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught Nora off guard. "That's very kind. It's practical, is all." He looked past her into the cabin. "Fires laid in the hearth, matches on the mantel. Night gets cold this time of year." "Thank you, Mr. Landry," he nodded once. "Supper in an hour if you'd care to join us, no obligation." Before she could respond, he was striding away again, his long legs carrying him quickly back toward the main house. Bear lingered a moment longer, wagging his tail hopefully, then trotted after his master. Left alone, Nora closed the door and leaned against it, feeling strangely safe for the first time since arriving in Montana territory. The man who had lifted her from that auction block remained a mystery, but his actions spoke of a decency she hadn't dared hope for when the bidding began. She unwrapped the bundle he'd brought, finding everything he'd mentioned plus a comb, a small mirror, and a cake of lavender-scented soap that must have cost a fair price at the general store. The dress was simple, a blue calico with white piping but clean and in good repair. An hour later, washed and changed, Nora made her way to the main house. Her wedding dress lay folded in the cabin, a reminder of hopes deferred but perhaps not abandoned entirely. When she knocked on the door, it was Hank who answered, his weathered face breaking into a welcoming smile. "Come in, Miss Lloyd. Stew's just ready." The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable, a large open room with a cooking area at one end, a dining table in the center, and a sitting area with bookshelves at the other. A hallway presumably led to bedrooms at the back. Everything was clean and orderly, if plainly furnished. Colton stood by the fireplace, gazing into the flames. He turned when she entered, and something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, at the transformation a clean dress and combed hair had wrought. "Miss Lloyd," he said with a slight nod. "You found your way all right. It wasn't difficult," she replied, gesturing to the short, visible path between the cabin and the house. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, I suppose not." Hank bustled about, setting the table. "Hope you like beef stew, Miss Lloyd. It's what I do best, according to Colt here." "It's about all you do," Colton said, but his tone was good-natured. "I'm sure it will be delicious," Nora said, moving to help set out the plates. "No need for that," Hank protested. "You're our guest." "I'd prefer to be useful, Mr. Miller." Hank glanced at Colton, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Well, if you insist, Miss Lloyd, but it's just Hank, if you please. Never did care for formalities out here." The meal was indeed delicious, hearty beef stew with fresh baked bread. Conversation was minimal at first, with Hank doing most of the talking, recounting the day's work on the ranch. Gradually, Nora found herself drawn into the discussion, asking questions about the cattle operation, the seasonal routines, the challenges of ranching in this part of Montana. "You seem to know something about farming," Colton observed during a lull in the conversation. "My uncle had a small farm in Massachusetts," Nora explained. "I spent summers there as a child. It's hardly comparable to your operation, but I understand the principles." "Book learning too, I expect," Hank said. "Colt mentioned you were a school teacher back east." "Yes, for 3 years." Nora hesitated, then added, "It was a good position, but with my parents gone and the school consolidating, I found myself at loose ends." Mr. Blackwell's advertisement seemed providential at the time. A silence fell over the table at the mention of Jonathan Blackwell. Colton's expression darkened slightly. "Jonathan wasn't a bad sort," he said finally, "just unlucky and sometimes careless with money. He didn't deserve what happened to him." "How did he die?" Nora asked, realizing she had never been told the details. Colton and Hank exchanged glances. "Horse threw him," Hank said. "Was coming back from town after dark, broke his neck from what Doc Adams could tell." "I see." Nora looked down at her plate. "It's strange to mourn someone I never met." "He spoke highly of you in his letters," Colton said quietly. "Seemed to think he'd finally found some good fortune." The sincerity in his voice touched Nora. "Thank you for telling me that." After dinner, Hank insisted on cleaning up, shooing both Nora and Colton toward the sitting area. Somewhat awkwardly, they settled into chairs near the fire. "You have quite a collection of books," Nora observed, noting the well-stocked shelves. "Winter nights are long," Colton replied. "Reading passes the time, may I?" She rose and approached the bookcase. "Help yourself." "You're welcome to borrow anything that interests you." Nora scanned the titles, impressed by the variety: history, poetry, novels, and practical manuals on everything from animal husbandry to carpentry. She selected a volume of Tennyson's poems. "An unexpected choice for a cattle rancher," she commented, opening the leather-bound book. "My mother's influence," Colton admitted. "She taught school before she married my father." "Another teacher," Nora smiled slightly. "Perhaps we would have gotten along." "I imagine so." He hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to write to her if you'd like another woman to correspond with. She's a good letter writer." The offer surprised Nora. It suggested he expected her stay to be of some duration. "That's very kind. I might take you up on that." They fell into silence again, but it was less uncomfortable than before. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, and the occasional howl of a coyote pierced the night. "I should return to the cabin," Nora said finally, rising from her chair. "Thank you for dinner and for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything he had done for her that day. Colton stood as well. "I'll walk you back." "There's no need, bears sometimes come down from the hills this time of year," he said matter-of-factly. "Best not to chance it." Before she could protest further, he was taking a lantern from a hook by the door. Hank called a cheerful good night from the kitchen, and then they were outside in the cool evening air. The short walk to the cabin was silent, their way lit by the golden glow of the lantern. When they reached the door, Nora turned to face him. "Mr. Landry, Colton," he interrupted. "Or Colt, most people call me Colt." "Colton," she amended. "I want to thank you properly for what you did today. You saved me from a terrible fate." He shifted uncomfortably. "Any decent man would have done the same. But they didn't. You did." She met his gaze directly. "I won't forget it." He looked away toward the distant mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "Get some rest, Miss Lloyd. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about what comes next." With that, he handed her the lantern and turned to go. Nora watched him stride back toward the main house, his figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. Inside the cabin, she lit a small fire and prepared for bed, hanging her borrowed dress carefully over a chair. As she slipped beneath the quilt on the narrow bed, the events of the day washed over her again: the humiliation of the auction, the fear, and then the unexpected rescue by a man who asked nothing in return. Sleep came surprisingly easily, deep and dreamless, as outside her window, the Montana night wrapped itself around Landry Ranch, and somewhere in the main house, a rancher named Colton lay awake, wondering what twist of fate had brought Nora Lloyd to his doorstep. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the cabin's curtains. For a moment, Nora was disoriented, forgetting where she was. Then memory returned: the auction, Colton Landry's intervention, the quiet dinner with him and Hank. She rose and dressed, splashing cold water from the basin onto her face. Outside, the ranch was already awake. She could hear the distant sounds of cattle, the neigh of horses, men's voices calling to one another. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find not Colton, but Hank, carrying a covered tray. "Morning, Miss Lloyd," he said cheerfully. "Brought you some breakfast. Thought you might appreciate a quiet meal after yesterday's excitement." "That's very thoughtful, thank you." She accepted the tray, which held a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, along with a steaming cup of coffee. "Colt rode into town at first light," Hank explained. "Said he'd be back by midday with your belongings from the Winters place." Nora set the tray on the table. "He shouldn't have troubled himself. There wasn't much." Hank's weathered face crinkled with a smile. "That boy never does anything halfway. Once he decides on a course, he sees it through." He tipped his hat. "I'll leave you to your breakfast. Feel free to explore the ranch if you're so inclined. Bear'll keep you company if you whistle for him." After he left, Nora ate the simple but hearty breakfast, considering her situation. Colton had made it clear she wasn't obligated to him, that she could leave whenever she wished, but where would she go? She had no money, no connections in this territory. Her teaching credentials might secure her a position eventually, but schools were few and far between in these parts. For now, at least, she would stay. Colton's offer of shelter and protection was more than she could have hoped for when she stood on that auction block. After breakfast, she decided to take Hank's suggestion and explore the ranch. The spring day was mild, the sky a vivid blue overhead. She whistled experimentally, and within moments, Bear came bounding around the corner of the main house, tail wagging furiously. "Good morning to you too," she laughed as the dog circled her excitedly. Together, they walked the perimeter of the ranch buildings. The barn was larger than it had appeared from a distance, housing at least a dozen horses in well-kept stalls. Several cowboys were working with the animals, and they tipped their hats respectfully when they noticed her. Beyond the barn lay corrals, equipment sheds, and a smithy where a burly man was shoeing a horse. In every direction, Nora saw evidence of careful planning and hard work. Colton Landry had built something substantial here, something that would last. Her exploration eventually led her to a fenced garden behind the main house. Though early in the season, someone had already turned the soil and planted rows of what would become vegetables. A small orchard of apple trees stood nearby, their branches just beginning to bud. Miss Lloyd. She turned to find Hank approaching, wiping his hands on a rag. "I hope I'm not trespassing," she said. "Not at all. Ranch is open to you." He gestured to the garden. "Not much to look at yet, but give it a month. We'll have greens at least, and later tomatoes, beans, potatoes." Colt insists on fresh vegetables. Says his mother would skin him alive if he lived on just meat and bread. "It's a fine garden," Nora said. "Who tends it?" Mostly Colt, believe it or not, says it clears his head. Hank squinted at the sun. He should be back soon, rode out mighty early. As if summoned by Hank's words, the sound of hoofbeats reached them. Bear's ears perked up and he raced toward the front of the property, barking joyfully. "That'll be him now," Hank said with a smile. "Dog always knows." They walked around the house to find Colton dismounting from his horse. Behind him, a second horse pulled a small cart laden with trunks and boxes. Bear danced around his master's legs, receiving an absent pat in greeting. "Successful trip, I see," Hank called. Colton looked up, his expression warming slightly when he saw Nora. "Mrs. Winters was holding your things, as you said. She sends her regards." "You brought everything?" Nora asked, surprised by the amount. "Everything she had." He began untying the first trunk. "Some folks in town weren't pleased to see me claiming your belongings, but Mrs. Winters set them straight." Nora could imagine the scene, this quiet, determined man facing down Jonathan Blackwell's creditors. "Thank you, I never expected." He waved off her gratitude. "It's yours by right." "I'll bring it to the cabin." "I can help," she insisted, moving forward to take a smaller box. Colton looked as if he might object, then thought better of it. With Hank's assistance, they soon had all of Nora's possessions transferred to the cabin. It wasn't much: 2 trunks of clothing and personal items, a box of books, and a crate containing household linens she had brought for her new life as a rancher's wife. "I'll leave you to sort through it all," Colton said when the last item was inside. "There's no rush, take your time." "Will you join us for dinner again this evening?" Hank asked from the doorway. "Yes, thank you," Nora replied. "And perhaps tomorrow I might cook for you both. It seems only fair to contribute while I'm here." Colton and Hank exchanged glances. "No need for that," Colton began. "I insist," Nora said firmly. "I'm not one to sit idle, Mr. Landry. If I'm to stay here, even temporarily, I'd like to be useful." A hint of respect flickered in his blue eyes. "As you wish, Miss Lloyd." When they had gone, Nora opened her trunks, reacquainting herself with possessions she had feared lost forever. Each item was a link to her past life: the cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, the embroidered handkerchiefs made by her own hand during long Boston evenings, the books that had been her companions through years of teaching. Among the items, she found the packet of letters from Jonathan Blackwell, missives that had convinced her to journey west to marry a stranger. She hesitated, then opened the most recent one, dated just a month before her departure from Boston. "I cannot promise romance," he had written, "but I can offer respect, security, and the chance to build something meaningful in this beautiful, wild country. The house stands ready for a woman's touch, and the town would welcome a teacher of your caliber." A pang of sadness struck her. Jonathan Blackwell's promises had died with him, but the dream of a new beginning remained. Perhaps in time she could find her place in this territory, even without the husband she had journeyed so far to meet. The remainder of the day passed quietly as Nora organized her belongings. Through the cabin window, she could see the activities of the ranch continuing: men riding out to check cattle, Hank working in the smithy, and occasionally Colton moving between tasks, his tall figure distinctive even at a distance. That evening at dinner, the conversation flowed more easily than the night before. Hank regaled her with tales of the early days of the ranch, when Colton had first arrived with nothing but determination and a few head of cattle. "Lived in a tent that first winter," Hank recalled. "Coldest winter in memory, too. Found him half frozen when I came through looking for work. Stubborn as a mule, wouldn't admit he needed help." Colton rolled his eyes. "Hank embellishes. It wasn't that bad." "Your lips were blue, boy, blue." Hank turned to Nora. I stayed on, partly because I needed the work, but mostly because I figured he'd die without someone watching over him. And 5 years later, he's still finding reasons to stay, Colton said dryly. The cooking, Hank declared. He keeps me around for the cooking. Nora laughed, caught up in their easy camaraderie. How did you learn to cook so well, Hank? Army, he replied. Served as a cook during the war, you learn to make something out of nothing when you're feeding hungry soldiers. Hank fought for the Union, Colton added. I was too young for the war, but my father and brothers served for the Confederacy. Nora raised an eyebrow. Yet you get along so well. War's over, Hank said simply. Out here, what matters is character, not which side you fought for. After dinner, as Nora was preparing to return to the cabin, Colton cleared his throat. I've been thinking about your situation, Miss Lloyd. She tensed, wondering if he was about to ask her to leave. Yes, Silver Creek needs a teacher. The last one left 6 months ago to get married. Children in town are running wild or learning whatever their parents can teach them. Nora's heart quickened. Are you suggesting? Town council meets Saturday. I could take you in, introduce you. With your experience, I expect they'd hire you on the spot. That would be wonderful, Nora said, genuinely moved by his thoughtfulness. But where would I live? In town. There's a small house behind the schoolhouse, Colton explained. Nothing fancy, but it comes with the position. You'd have your independence. The word hung in the air between them. It was what she had sought in coming west, not to be dependent on a husband's charity or a stranger's kindness, but to make her own way. Thank you, she said softly. I would like that very much. He nodded, seeming pleased by her response. We'll ride in Saturday, then. That night, Nora lay awake thinking about Colton's offer. A teaching position would give her purpose and a place in the community. She would no longer be the abandoned bride, the woman sold on an auction block, but Miss Lloyd, the school teacher. And yet, as she drifted towards sleep, she found herself wondering why the thought of leaving Landry Ranch filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Nora spent her mornings exploring the ranch or reading, her afternoons helping with whatever tasks seemed appropriate, mending linens, assisting Hank with meal preparations, or tending the garden. Each evening she joined Colton and Hank for dinner, gradually learning more about the two men and the life they had built. Colton, she discovered, was 30 years old, born in Tennessee to a farming family that had lost nearly everything in the war. He had come west at 25, determined to build something that couldn't be taken from him. Quiet by nature, he spoke little of himself, but his actions revealed a man of integrity and surprising kindness. On Friday afternoon, Nora was in the garden, weeding around the newly sprouted plants when she sensed someone watching her. She looked up to find Colton standing a few yards away, his expression unreadable. You have a knack for that, he said, nodding toward her work. Nora brushed dirt from her hands. My uncle taught me. He said plants respond to those who care for them properly. Seems to be true of most living things. He hesitated, then added, I was heading to check the north pasture. Thought you might like to see more of the ranch before tomorrow. The invitation surprised her. I'd like that very much. I'll saddle a horse for you. 20 minutes later, Nora found herself mounted on a gentle mare named Daisy, following Colton along a trail that wound through stands of pine and across open meadows. She was a competent rider, thanks again to summers at her uncle's farm, and kept pace easily. The property extends to that ridge, Colton explained, pointing to a distant line of hills. About 2,000 acres now, started with just the southern section, added the rest as I could afford it. It's beautiful, Nora said, taking in the sweep of land with its mix of forest and pasture. Peaceful? That's why I chose it. He glanced at her. Different from Boston, I expect. Very, but in the best possible way. She breathed deeply of the pine-scented air. I never felt I belonged there, not really. Too many people, too many rules about what a woman could or couldn't do. Colton nodded thoughtfully. Territory's different. People judge you on what you can contribute, not where you came from or who your family was. They rode in companionable silence for a time, cresting a hill that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. In the distance, the buildings of Landry Ranch looked like toys against the vast landscape. You've built something remarkable, Nora said. You should be proud. A rare, genuine smile crossed Colton's face. I am. It's not always easy, but it's mine. Every fence post, every head of cattle. And soon you'll have orchards and gardens as well, she added, a self-sufficient kingdom. Hardly a kingdom, he demurred, but she could see her words had pleased him. As they turned the horses homeward, Nora found herself wishing the ride could continue. There was something freeing about being on horseback in this open country, with only Colton for company. He didn't demand conversation, but seemed content with silence, allowing her to absorb the beauty around them. When they reached the barn, he dismounted quickly and came to help her down. His hands encircled her waist, lifting her effortlessly from the saddle. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that Nora could see flecks of gray in his blue eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. Then he stepped back, releasing her as if burned. Thank you for the ride, she said, suddenly conscious of the flush in her cheeks. My pleasure. His voice was gruff, his gaze now fixed on the horses. I'd best get these two cooled down and brushed. Nora nodded and turned toward the cabin, aware of a strange fluttering in her chest. It had been a long time since a man's proximity had affected her so strongly, perhaps never, if she was honest with herself. The gentleman of Boston had always seemed pale and insubstantial compared to her ideals. Colton Landry, with his quiet strength and integrity, was something else entirely. Saturday dawned clear and warm. Nora dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a navy blue cotton with white piping that complemented her fair coloring. She had spent the previous evening reviewing her teaching credentials and preparing what she would say to the town council. When she emerged from the cabin, she found Colton waiting with the wagon, dressed in clean clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing. You look nice, he said, the compliment seeming to surprise them both. Thank you. She accepted his hand up into the wagon. I want to make a good impression. The ride to Silver Creek took just under 2 hours. As they approached the town, Nora felt her anxiety rising. The last time she had been here, she had suffered the ultimate humiliation on the auction block. Now she was returning with her head held high, seeking a position of respect in the community. The council meets at noon in the back room of the hotel, Colton explained as they drove down the main street. Several people stopped to stare at them, clearly surprised by Nora's return. I know most of them. Good men for the most part. For the most part, Nora raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile touched his lips. Well, Harlan Sanders can be difficult, thinks education is wasted on girls, but he's outnumbered on the council. They pulled up in front of the Silver Creek Hotel, a 2-story building that served as the town's social center. Colton helped Nora down from the wagon, then offered his arm. Ready, she took a deep breath and placed her hand on his forearm. Ready. Inside, they were directed to a room at the back of the building, where 5 men sat around a table littered with papers. They looked up as Colton and Nora entered, surprise evident on their faces. Landry, one of the men said, rising, didn't expect to see you in town 2 Saturdays in a row. Henry, Colton nodded. Gentlemen, I've brought someone I think you'll want to meet. This is Miss Nora Lloyd, formerly a schoolteacher in Boston. Miss Lloyd, the Silver Creek Town Council. Nora stepped forward, conscious of the men's scrutiny. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I understand you're in need of a teacher for your children. The oldest of the men, white-haired and sharp-eyed, leaned forward. That we are, Miss Lloyd, but aren't you the woman who was? Ah, that is. Yes, Mr. Simmons, Albert Simmons. Yes, Mr. Simmons. I am the woman who arrived as Jonathan Blackwell's intended bride and found myself in unfortunate circumstances upon his death. Nora kept her voice steady. However, before that, I taught for 3 years at the Prescott School for Girls in Boston. I have my credentials with me, as well as letters of recommendation. She produced the documents from her reticule, spreading them on the table for inspection. The men leaned forward, examining them with interest. These are impressive, Miss Lloyd, said a younger man with spectacles. I'm Dr. Wilson, by the way, the town's physician and a member of the council. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. What subjects did you teach in Boston? Asked another councilman. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and basic sciences, Nora replied confidently. I also offered optional lessons in French and music for students who wished to pursue them. The council members exchanged glances, clearly impressed. Only one, a florid-faced man with a bristling mustache who Nora assumed must be Harlan Sanders, looked skeptical. That's all well and good for a fancy Eastern school, he said dismissively. But out here, children need practical learning. Can you teach a boy to calculate the board feet in a load of lumber? Can you teach a girl to keep proper household accounts? I can teach children of both sexes the mathematical principles that underlie such calculations, Nora replied evenly. And I'm always willing to adapt my curriculum to the specific needs of a community. The answer seemed to satisfy most of the council, though Sanders harumphed skeptically. There's also the matter of your situation, Simmons said delicately. You came here to be married, but now you're under Mr. Landry's protection. Nora felt Colton stiffen beside her. Miss Lloyd is a guest at my ranch while she decides on her future, he said, his voice cool. Her character is beyond reproach. Of course, Simmons said hastily. No offense intended, it's just that the teacher sets an example for the children, you understand. I assure you, Mr. Simmons, that my conduct has always been and will always be above reproach, Nora said firmly. I came west with honorable intentions and have conducted myself accordingly despite difficult circumstances. Dr. Wilson nodded approvingly. Well said, Miss Lloyd, and frankly, gentlemen, we're in no position to be overly particular. The children of this town have been without proper schooling for half a year. After a few more questions about her teaching methods and experience, the council asked Nora to step outside while they deliberated. Colton accompanied her into the hotel hallway. You handled that well, he said quietly. Thank you. I've had practice defending my abilities to skeptical men. She smiled slightly. School boards in Boston were no different, just better dressed. A chuckle escaped him the first time she had heard him laugh. The sound warmed her. They didn't have to wait long. Within 15 minutes, Dr. Wilson opened the door and invited them back in. 4 of the 5 councilmen were smiling, only Sanders maintained a sour expression. Miss Lloyd, Simmons said, rising to his feet. The council has voted to offer you the position of teacher at Silver Creek School, effective immediately. The salary is $40 per month, with use of the teacher's cottage behind the schoolhouse. The spring term has already begun, so we'd hope you could start as soon as possible, perhaps Monday, joy surged through Nora. I accept, Mr. Simmons, and yes, I can begin on Monday. Excellent, Simmons beamed. Dr. Wilson will show you the schoolhouse and cottage after our meeting concludes. We typically have about 20 students, ages 6 to 16, though attendance varies with the seasons. After signing the necessary papers and receiving a copy of the school regulations, Nora and Colton followed Dr. Wilson to the schoolhouse at the end of the main street. It was a simple one-room building with rows of desks facing a teacher's desk on a raised platform. Behind it, as promised, stood a small cottage 2 rooms with basic furnishings. It's not luxurious, Dr. Wilson apologized, but it's sound and weather-tight. The previous teacher, Miss Holloway, left everything in good order before she married and moved to Oregon. It's perfect, Nora said, genuinely pleased. The cottage was clean and bright, with shelves for books and a small kitchen area. It would be a place of her own, something she had not had even in Boston, where she had boarded with the family of one of her students. After Dr. Wilson left, Nora turned to Colton, unable to contain her excitement. I can't believe it happened so quickly. My own school, my own home. You deserve it, he said simply. They're lucky to have you. The sincerity in his voice touched her. I couldn't have done this without your help, Colton. First the auction, then retrieving my belongings, now this. He shrugged, characteristically uncomfortable with gratitude. Just did what needed doing. They stood in silence for a moment, looking around the cottage that would soon be Nora's home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. When will you move in? Colton asked finally. I should probably come tomorrow to prepare for classes on Monday, Nora replied, suddenly aware that her time at Landry Ranch was coming to an end. The realization brought a surprising pang of regret. "I'll bring your things in the morning, then." He hesitated, then added, "You're still welcome at the ranch anytime, for dinner or whenever you like." The invitation warmed her. "Thank you, I'd like that." They returned to the wagon and headed back to the ranch, the conversation turning to practical matters: what supplies she would need for teaching, how many students she might expect, the curriculum she would develop. Yet beneath the ordinary discussion, Nora sensed a shift in their relationship. She was no longer simply a woman Colton had rescued, but a person establishing her own place in the community. That evening at dinner, Hank was delighted by the news of Nora's appointment. "Knew they'd snap you up. Those town children are running wild as jackrabbits without a teacher." "I just hope I can live up to everyone's expectations," Nora said, a flutter of nervousness returning. "It's different teaching here than in Boston." "You'll do fine," Colton said with quiet confidence. "Children respond to someone who cares about their learning." His faith in her abilities touched Nora deeply. This man, who had known her less than a week, seemed to understand her strengths in a way few others ever had. After dinner, as Hank cleared the dishes, Colton cleared his throat. "I have something for you, a small gift for your new position." From beneath his chair, he produced a package wrapped in brown paper. Surprised, Nora accepted it, untying the string that held the paper closed. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden box with a hinged lid. "Open it," Colton urged. Nora lifted the lid to find the box filled with chalk, pencils, a ruler, and several small slates, teaching supplies that would have been difficult to obtain on short notice in Silver Creek. "Colton, when did you?" "I ordered it from Helena last month after the previous teacher left," he explained. "Thought whoever took the position might need supplies, arrived on yesterday's stage." The thoughtfulness of the gesture overwhelmed her. That he had considered the needs of an unknown teacher and now was giving this gift to her spoke volumes about his character. "Thank you," she said softly. "This will be invaluable." He nodded, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "Just practical?" "No," Nora shook her head. "It's kind." "You're a kind man, Colton Landry, though you try to hide it behind practicality." His blue eyes met hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Hank returned from the kitchen, breaking the spell. "What's this?" "Presents and none for your faithful cook," he teased. The tension dissolved into laughter, but Nora didn't miss the way Colton's gaze returned to her throughout the evening, thoughtful and perhaps a little wondering. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the first rain since Nora's arrival in Montana. She packed her belongings carefully, leaving the cabin as neat as she had found it. A sense of melancholy settled over her despite her excitement about the teaching position. In less than a week, Landry Ranch had begun to feel like home in a way Boston never had. Colton arrived at the cabin just after breakfast, his hat and shoulders damp from the rain. "Wagon's ready whenever you are," he said, helping her carry the trunks outside. They rode to Silver Creek mostly in silence, the steady patter of rain on the wagon's canvas cover creating a cocoon of privacy around them. Nora stole glances at Colton's profile: the strong jaw, the straight nose, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. She had never met a man quite like him, so self-contained, and yet so fundamentally decent. At the teacher's cottage, he helped her unload her belongings, carrying the heavy trunks inside without complaint despite the mud and rain. When everything was inside, they stood awkwardly in the small front room, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Will you be all right here?" Colton asked, glancing around the cottage. "Do you need anything else before I go?" "I'll be fine," Nora assured him. "Doctor." Wilson said Mrs. Turner from the general store would bring over some basic provisions this afternoon. "And I should spend today preparing for tomorrow's classes anyway." He nodded, his hat in his hands. "The offer stands. You're welcome at the ranch anytime, for dinner or just to visit." "Thank you." Nora hesitated, then added, "Perhaps next Saturday. If you're coming to town for supplies, we could have dinner at the hotel." A smile touched his lips, one of his rare, genuine smiles that transformed his serious face. "I'd like that." When he had gone, Nora stood at the window watching the wagon disappear down the muddy street. A chapter had closed her time as a dependent, a woman in need of rescue. Tomorrow would begin a new one as Miss Lloyd, the Silver Creek schoolteacher. Yet as she turned to unpack her belongings, she knew that Colton Landry would remain part of her story, whatever shape it might take. Monday morning arrived bright and clear, the weekend's rain having washed the world clean. Nora stood at the door of the schoolhouse, bell in hand, watching as children began to arrive, some eagerly, others with clear reluctance. By 9 o'clock, 18 students had assembled in the classroom, ranging from 6-year-old twins with identical freckled faces to a lanky 16-year-old boy who slouched in the back row. Nora rang the bell one final time, then stepped to the teacher's platform. "Good morning," she said clearly. "I am Miss Lloyd, your new teacher. Before we begin, I'd like each of you to stand, tell me your name, age, and one thing you enjoy learning about." The introductions proceeded smoothly, giving Nora a sense of each child's personality and educational level. Most seemed genuinely pleased to have a teacher again, though a few of the older boys displayed the skepticism she had expected. "Now," she said when they had finished, "education is a partnership between teacher and students. I will do my best to provide you with the knowledge and skills you need, but you must do your part by paying attention and completing your work." She outlined her expectations for behavior and study, then divided the class into groups based on age and ability for their first lessons. By noon, when she dismissed them for the midday meal, Nora felt cautiously optimistic. These children were bright and eager, if somewhat behind in their studies due to the gap in formal education. As the students scattered to their homes for lunch, Nora stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. To her surprise, she found Colton leaning against a hitching post across the street watching the proceedings. "Colton," she called, crossing to meet him. "What brings you to town?" "Had business with the bank," he explained. "Thought I'd see how your first morning went." The fact that he had made a special trip to town, a 4-hour round journey just to check on her first day of teaching, touched Nora deeply. "It went well, I think," she said, smiling. "The children are bright, just a bit undisciplined after months without regular schooling." "They'll learn quickly with you teaching them," he said with that quiet confidence that always warmed her. "Would you like to come in and see the classroom? I've rearranged things a bit." He hesitated, then nodded. "For a few minutes. Need to start back soon if I want to reach the ranch before dark." Inside the schoolhouse, Nora showed him the changes she had made, reorganizing the desks for better group work, setting up a reading corner with the few books available, creating a nature table where students could display interesting finds. "You've accomplished a lot in one day," Colton observed. "I've always believed the environment affects learning," Nora explained. "A well-organized, welcoming classroom encourages children to engage with their studies." He nodded, his gaze taking in the room before settling on her. "You seem happy." "I am," she admitted. "Teaching has always brought me joy, and having my own school, my own home, it's more than I dared hope for when I came west." Something flickered across his face, satisfaction perhaps, but tinged with another emotion she couldn't quite identify. "I'm glad," he said simply. "You deserve happiness, Nora." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected thrill through her. Before she could respond, the schoolhouse door opened, and students began returning for the afternoon session. "I should go," Colton said, reaching for his hat. "Good luck with the rest of the day." "Thank you for coming," Nora replied. "I'll see you Saturday." He nodded once, then slipped out the side door as the children filled their seats, curiosity evident on their young faces. "Who was that man, Miss Lloyd?" asked Sally Turner, the 8-year-old daughter of the general store owners. "Mr. Landry is a friend," Nora replied, moving back to the teacher's platform. "Now let's continue with our arithmetic lesson." The remainder of the week passed in a blur of lessons, getting to know her students and settling into life in Silver Creek. The townspeople were welcoming, if curious about her unusual arrival in their community. Mrs. Turner from the general store proved especially friendly, inviting Nora to Sunday dinner and introducing her to other women in town. By Saturday, Nora had established a comfortable routine. She spent the morning cleaning the cottage and planning lessons for the coming week, then bathed and changed into her best remaining dress for her dinner with Colton. Looking in the mirror, she was struck by the changes in her appearance since her arrival in Montana. Her face had acquired a light tan from walking to and from school, and there was a sparkle in her eyes that had been absent in Boston. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock came at her door. Colton stood on the step, hat in hand, dressed in clean clothes that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean build. "Good evening," he said, a hint of shyness in his manner. "You look lovely." "Thank you." Nora accepted his offered arm. "You look very nice yourself." They walked to the hotel dining room where the hostess showed them to a table by the window. Several townspeople nodded greetings, their curiosity evident but not unwelcoming. "How was your week?" Colton asked as they settled into their chairs. "Busy but wonderful," Nora replied, her enthusiasm bubbling over. "The children are making progress already. Even Mr. Sanders' son, who I was warned would be difficult, has shown interest in our geography lessons." Colton smiled, clearly enjoying her excitement. "Winning over the father through the son, clever strategy." "I hadn't thought of it that way," Nora laughed. "But I suppose it can't hurt. How are things at the ranch? Spring calving is nearly finished. Lost only 2 this year, which is better than most." He paused as the waiter brought their meal's beefsteak for Colton, chicken for Nora. "Hank says to tell you he misses your conversation at dinner, says I'm poor company." "I miss your dinners too," Nora admitted, "both the food and the company." A comfortable silence fell as they began to eat. Outside the window, Silver Creek's Main Street was active with Saturday evening traffic, ranchers in town for supplies, families visiting, young men heading toward the saloon at the end of the street. "Town's growing," Colton observed, following her gaze. "Railroad survey team was through last month. If they decide to bring the line this way, Silver Creek could become an important stop." "That would change things considerably," Nora said. "More families, more children needing education, more opportunity," he added, "for everyone." Their conversation meandered pleasantly through the meal, touching on the ranch, the school, mutual acquaintances, and books they had both read. Nora found herself relaxing completely in Colton's company, appreciating his thoughtful comments and the quiet attentiveness with which he listened to her. After dinner, he suggested a walk before returning to her cottage. The evening was mild, with a full moon rising over the eastern hills, bathing the town in silver light. "It's beautiful here," Nora said as they strolled along the quiet side streets. "I never expected to feel so at home so quickly." "You belong here," Colton said simply. "Anyone can see that." They paused at the edge of town where the street gave way to open country. In the distance, the silhouette of mountains was visible against the star-filled sky. "When I first arrived," Nora said quietly, "standing on that auction block, I thought all my dreams had ended. Now, just 2 weeks later, I have a position I love, a home of my own, and—" She hesitated, then added softly, "and friends I never expected to find." Colton turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Nora, whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the approach of Dr. Wilson, hurrying along the street toward them. "Miss Lloyd, Mr. Landry, glad I found you," the doctor called. "Mrs. Turner's gone into labor early. She's asking for female assistants, and the midwife is out at the Peterson farm. Would you be willing to help, Miss Lloyd?" "Of course," Nora replied immediately. "I've assisted at births before." Dr. Wilson looked relieved. "Excellent, her house is just this way." Colton touched Nora's arm lightly. "I'll wait for you at the hotel. Take as long as you need." The grateful look she gave him warmed something deep in his chest. He watched her hurry away with the doctor, admiring her immediate willingness to help a neighbor in need. Nearly 3 hours later, Nora found Colton still waiting patiently in the hotel lobby, reading a newspaper. He stood as she entered, concern evident on his face. "Everything all right?" "Yes," Nora smiled, despite her exhaustion. "A beautiful baby girl, mother and child are both well." "You look tired," he observed. "Let me walk you home." Outside, the night had grown cool. Without comment, Colton removed his jacket and placed it around Nora's shoulders. The weight of it was comforting, carrying with it his warmth and scent leather, pine, and something uniquely him. "Thank you," she said, drawing it closer around her, "for waiting and for this. No need for thanks." They walked in companionable silence to her cottage. At the door, Nora returned his jacket reluctantly. "I enjoyed our dinner," she said, "before the interruption. As did I." He hesitated, then added, "Perhaps we could make it a regular arrangement. Saturday evenings." Joy bloomed in Nora's chest. "I'd like that very much." He smiled, one of his rare, full smiles that transformed his face. "Good night, then, Miss Lloyd." "Good night, Mr. Landry." As she watched him walk away, Nora found herself wondering what he had been about to say before Dr. Wilson's interruption. Whatever it was, she had a feeling it might have changed everything between them. Spring gave way to summer, and Nora's life in Silver Creek settled into a pleasant routine. Her days were filled with teaching, her evenings with grading papers and preparing lessons, and her Saturday nights with dinner in Colton's company. Occasionally, she would visit the ranch on Sundays, enjoying Hank's cooking and the peaceful atmosphere she had come to associate with Landry Ranch. Her relationship with Colton evolved gradually from rescuer and rescued to genuine friendship. He would bring her books from his collection that he thought might interest her. She would save interesting rocks or plants her students found for his growing natural history shelf. Their conversations deepened, revealing shared values and complementary perspectives on everything from education to the development of the territory. Yet neither spoke of anything beyond friendship, though Nora found herself increasingly aware of him as a man, the strength in his hands as he helped her into a wagon, the rare sound of his laughter, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. One hot July afternoon, Nora dismissed her summer students early. With harvest approaching, many children were needed at home, and the schoolhouse had become stifling in the summer heat. As she was closing up the building, she heard a wagon approaching and looked up to see Colton driving toward the school. "This is a surprise," she said as he pulled up beside her. "I didn't expect to see you until Saturday." "Thought you might like to come out to the ranch for the afternoon," he replied. "It's cooler by the creek and Hank's been experimenting with ice cream." The invitation was tempting. Her cottage would be unbearably hot, and the prospect of cold treats by a shaded creek was irresistible. "Let me just get my hat." The ride to the ranch was pleasant despite the heat, with a breeze created by the moving wagon. Colton talked about the progress of the hay harvest and plans for expanding the orchard next spring. Nora found herself relaxing, the tension of the hot schoolroom melting away. At the ranch, Hank greeted them enthusiastically, proudly showing off the ice cream maker he had ordered from back east. "Got the ice from the ice house we built last winter," he explained. "Cranked it myself while you two were on the road, vanilla with wild blackberries." They carried bowls of the cold treat down to the creek, where a stand of cottonwoods provided welcome shade. Sitting on a fallen log, Nora closed her eyes in bliss at the first taste. "This is heavenly," she sighed. "Thank you both for rescuing me from my hot cottage." "Happy to oblige," Hank grinned. "Though it was Colt's idea, said you'd be suffering in that schoolhouse oven were his exact words." Colton shot his friend a warning look, but Nora just smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. After they finished the ice cream, Hank excused himself to check on dinner preparations, leaving Nora and Colton alone by the creek. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the water ripple over stones and the rustle of leaves overhead. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Colton said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "The school term ends in August, doesn't it?" "Yes, for a harvest break," Nora confirmed. "We resume in October after the crops are in," he nodded, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I was wondering what your plans are, for the future, I mean." Nora looked at him questioningly. "My plans? Do you intend to stay in Silver Creek, continue teaching?" He paused, then added more quietly, "Or were you thinking of returning east eventually?" The question surprised her. "I have no intention of returning east. Silver Creek is my home now." She hesitated, then asked, "Why do you ask?" Colton threw a small stone into the creek, watching the ripples spread outward. "Just wondering, the town's growing, railroads definitely coming through next year." You might have other opportunities. I'm happy teaching, Nora said slowly, trying to understand the direction of his thoughts. The town council has already approved funds to expand the school next year. We'll need a second teacher soon. Good, that's good. He seemed relieved, yet still oddly tense. A suspicion began to form in Nora's mind. Over the past months, she had come to care deeply for this quiet, honorable man more deeply than she had ever expected. Was it possible he felt the same? Colton, she said gently. Is there something specific you want to ask me? He met her gaze then, his blue eyes serious. Yes, but I'm not sure I have the right. Why wouldn't you have the right? Because of how we met. Because I paid for you at that auction. His jaw tightened at the memory. I never want you to feel obligated to me because of that, understanding dawned. Is that why you've never? Why we've remained just friends? Because you're afraid I might feel indebted to you, he nodded once, his gaze dropping to his hands. Nora's heart swelled with tenderness. All this time, he had been keeping his distance out of respect for her freedom, afraid that any declaration of deeper feelings might seem coercive given their unusual beginning. Colton Landry, she said firmly, look at me. Surprised by her tone, he raised his eyes to hers. I have never, not for one moment, felt that I owed you anything but gratitude for your kindness. You gave me freedom and opportunity when you could have demanded far more. That day on the auction block, you saw me as a person when others saw property. She moved closer to him on the log, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. If there's something you want to ask me, she continued more softly, please do, as equals, as friends who have come to know each other well over these past months. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something like wonder in his expression. Then he reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle yet sure. Nora Lloyd, he said, his voice low and earnest, I have come to care for you deeply, more than I ever thought possible. I would be honored if you would consider a future with me not out of obligation, but because you might feel something similar. Joy bubbled up inside her. Colton, I have been half in love with you since you lifted me down from that auction block with such gentle hands. The more I've come to know you, the more certain I've become of my feelings. Hope blazed in his eyes. Then you would consider. Yes, she said simply, I would consider a future with you. In fact, I can imagine no future I would want more. His smile, that rare, transformative smile, broke across his face like sunrise. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. When they parted, he kept her hand in his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I don't want to rush you, he said. We can take all the time you need. I don't need much time, Nora replied honestly. I know my heart, Colton. I've known it for months. He kissed her again, more firmly this time, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. When they separated, both were breathless. I should have asked you months ago, he murmured. Perhaps we needed this time, Nora suggested, to know each other as friends first. From the direction of the house, they heard Hank calling that dinner was ready. Reluctantly, they rose from their seat by the creek, but Colton kept hold of her hand as they walked back. Are you going to tell him? Nora asked, nodding toward the house where Hank waited. Colton's lips twitched. He probably already knows. Not much gets past Hank. Sure enough, when they reached the porch, Hank took one look at their clasped hands and let out a whoop of delight. Well, it's about time. Thought I'd have to lock you two in the root cellar to get you to speak up, Colt. Colton rolled his eyes, but his smile didn't fade. Dinner ready or not, old man, ready and waiting. Got a special bottle of wine too, been saving it for a worthy occasion. Hank winked at Nora. Think this qualifies. That evening was one of the happiest of Nora's life. The three of them ate dinner on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Hank told stories of Colton's early days on the ranch, making Nora laugh until her sides ached. And through it all, Colton kept her close, as if afraid she might disappear if he let her go. When it came time to return to town, Colton drove slowly, extending their time together. The summer night was perfect warm with a gentle breeze, the moon rising full and bright over the eastern hills. I was thinking, he said as they approached Silver Creek, about the harvest break from school. Yes, Nora prompted when he paused. Would you consider spending it at the ranch? There's plenty of room and Hank would be over the moon to have you there. Just Hank, she teased. He glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. You know better than that. I do, she admitted. And yes, I'd love to spend the break at the ranch. When they reached her cottage, he helped her down from the wagon, then drew her close for a lingering kiss. Saturday feels very far away, he murmured against her hair. It does, she agreed. But I have papers to grade and you have a ranch to run. Practical as always, Miss Lloyd. He kissed her once more, then reluctantly released her. Sleep well. You too, Colton. As she watched him drive away, Nora felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The path that had brought her west had been unexpected and at times painful, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The following Saturday, Colton arrived at her cottage with a small box in his hand. After greeting her with a kiss, he presented it to her somewhat nervously. "What's this?" Nora asked, taking the wooden box similar to the one he had given her with teaching supplies, but smaller. "Open it and see." Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire. "It was my grandmother's," Colton explained quietly. "My mother sent it when I wrote to her about you." Nora looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. "You wrote to your mother about me, weeks ago," he admitted. "I told her I'd met the woman I wanted to spend my life with." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes. "Oh, Colton, I know it's soon," he said hurriedly. "We've only just spoken of our feelings. If you want to wait, I understand completely, but I wanted you to know my intentions," or she stopped his words with a kiss. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, I will marry you, Colton Landry." Joy bloomed across his face. "Are you certain? You don't need more time?" "I'm certain," Nora said firmly. "I love you. I have for months." He took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the sapphire catching the light like a captured star. "I love you too," he said, the words clearly new to his lips but no less sincere for it. "More than I can say." They were married in October, after the harvest, in a simple ceremony at the Silver Creek Church. The entire town turned out for the event, along with ranchers from miles around. Colton's mother made the journey from Tennessee, a small, dignified woman with her son's blue eyes who embraced Nora with genuine warmth. "He wrote such beautiful letters about you," she told Nora the evening before the wedding. "I've never seen such words from my quiet son. You've awakened something in him that I feared might never surface after all he's been through." "He's awakened something in me too," Nora replied honestly. "I came west looking for security, for a place to belong. I found so much more." The wedding itself was everything Nora could have wished for, simple but meaningful, surrounded by people who had become dear to her in the months since her arrival. When Colton lifted her veil and kissed her as his wife for the first time, she felt the last echoes of that humiliating auction day fade completely away. Afterward, they drove to the ranch, now their home together, where Hank had prepared a magnificent feast for the wedding guests. Tables had been set up in the yard, lanterns hung from tree branches, and a space cleared for dancing. As evening fell and stars began to appear overhead, Colton led Nora away from the celebration to a quiet spot beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Completely," she assured him, leaning back against his chest. "And you, more than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "When I saw you on that auction block, something in me couldn't bear to see you hurt. I never imagined where that moment would lead us." "Sometimes the worst days of our lives can lead to the best," Nora mused. "If I hadn't lost my teaching position in Boston, if Jonathan Blackwell hadn't advertised for a bride, if you hadn't been in town that day." If, Colton murmured. "Too many chances for us never to have met." "But we did meet," she reminded him, turning in his arms to face him. "And here we are, he agreed, bending to kiss her. "Mr. and Mrs. Landry." The words sent a thrill through Nora. She had come west as Miss Lloyd, seeking a new name and a new life as Mrs. Blackwell. Fate had intervened, bringing her instead to this moment, this man, this love that surpassed anything she could have imagined. From the yard came the sounds of music and laughter as their guests continued the celebration. Soon they would need to return, to dance and accept congratulations, to cut the wedding cake Hank had labored over for days. But for now, they stood together in the moonlight, husband and wife, rancher and teacher, two people who had found in each other the home they had both been seeking. "I love you, Colton Landry," Nora whispered. "And I love you, Nora Landry," he replied, the words coming easier now. Forever. As winter settled over Montana territory, bringing snow to the mountains and cold, clear days to the valley, life at Landry Ranch settled into a new rhythm. Nora continued teaching at the Silver Creek School, returning each evening to the ranch where Colton would be waiting, often riding out to meet her as she crested the final hill on her sturdy mare. Their first Christmas as husband and wife was a joyous affair, with Hank outdoing himself on the feast and Colton surprising Nora with bookshelves he had built in secret for their bedroom, filled with volumes ordered from as far away as San Francisco and New York. "For your collection," he explained as she ran her fingers over the fine craftsmanship. "And for the children we might have someday. Every child should grow up with books." The thought of children, their children, filled Nora with a warm glow that carried her through the cold winter months. By spring, that hope had become reality. As the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared in her garden, Nora confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was expecting their first child. When she told Colton, his reaction was everything she could have wished for, joy mingled with protective concern, his strong hands gentle as they rested on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our baby. Due in November, doctor." "Wilson thinks," Nora said, covering his hands with her own. That evening they sat on the porch watching the sunset, planning for their expanding family. Colton would add a nursery to the house. Nora would train a replacement teacher for when she needed to take time away from the school. "I never expected such happiness," Colton admitted, his arm around her shoulders. "When I came west, all I wanted was land, independence. I never thought about a family of my own. And I came seeking security, perhaps companionship," Nora replied. "I never dreamed of finding such love." He kissed her then, a kiss full of tenderness and promise. "From the auction block to here," he murmured. "Quite a journey." "The best journey," Nora agreed, nestling closer to her husband as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, "and it's only just beginning." In the years that followed, the Landry family grew and prospered. Their first child, a son they named James Henry after both their fathers, arrived on a snowy November night with Hank pacing nervously outside the bedroom door. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Elizabeth Marie, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's gentle spirit. Landry Ranch expanded as well, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Colton's careful management and willingness to adopt new methods earned him respect throughout the region, while Nora's work with the school helped establish Silver Creek as a community that valued education. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Colton and Nora would sit by the creek where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. They would talk of the day's events, their hopes for their children, plans for the future. And occasionally, they would remember that day in Silver Creek, a bride in tears on an auction block, a quiet rancher who paid every dollar he had to lift her down. "The best money I ever spent," Colton would say, holding her close. And Nora, safe in the arms of the man who had seen her value when others saw only price, would smile and whisper, "The best day of my life." For from that moment of deepest humiliation had come the greatest joy, a love that transformed them both, a family that filled their hearts, and a future brighter than either had dared to dream.